there, welcome to the eCommerce Nurse podcast, our 28th episode. I'm Karina McLeod, ex-Amazonian and CEO and founder of eCommerce Nurse and Vendor Society. Today we're going to be talking about those key steps brand manufacturers must take to drive a successful digital transformation. We have a special guest, Lauren Livak, the director of the Digital Shelf Institute, also known as the DSI. The mission of the DSI is to shape the future of the industry and advance the growth of consumer commerce through community, content, and education. It has over 4,500 members from across the industry, and Lauren leads the charge in fostering the community and creating relevant and impactful content and connections for the industry. She knows firsthand what it takes to work through digital transformation, as she led the digital shelf for North America at Johnson & Johnson and was responsible for building the strategy, owning the digital tech stack, and leading the team to grow online sales. Hi, Lauren. Big thank you for taking the time to come on our show today. This is a topic I am extremely excited to talk about, particularly because I started my career in buying in bricks and mortar and then moved over to the digital world.
Thank you for having me. I am also super excited about it because, like you said in the intro, I went through it and I wish that there were a lot more conversations about it when I was going through it. So really excited to chat about it.
Awesome. And so I've already mentioned digital transformation, and these are words that are out there quite a bit. So can you talk to me about what we mean by that term digital transformation? Because I'm guessing there's some people listening that are familiar, might be on the journey, and then others are like, well, what does it mean and how do I get started?
I'm glad that we started with that question because it really could mean different things at different stages of maturity. So I see that a lot of companies are either really in the beginning stages, and what that means for them in terms of digital transformation is just understanding the importance of what digital means in the organization. How are you selling digitally? What do you need to do with your people, process, and technology to be able to compete in a digital world? Maybe for people who've been on the digital journey for a while, already have things established, digital transformation is figuring out what that next step is to become more profitable, or to figure out what the next experience is online to try and attract people in a different way. So I think digital transformation as a whole is really getting your organization ready to compete in the digital space that we're in now, and to be able to be agile to shift as the digital world changes, knowing that everybody's at a different stage and everybody needs to think about different things in a different way.
That's really interesting, because you always sort of think of it as in sort of the base, the parts of the actual selling part. But as you've just mentioned, there's so much more to it in terms of around the infrastructure and people, processes, and it's a lot more complex, especially for these larger organizations, right?
And I think that's why it's so challenging, to your point. Yeah. You have to go from inception of an idea of a new product to it's being sold online and shipped. I mean, think about all of the functions that are involved in that. R&D, supply chain, legal, regulatory, and they need to understand all of the nuances of e-commerce, which is just very, very different thinking than the brick and mortar world. So for a big company who's traditionally operated like that for hundreds of years, it's really a mind shift. And you need to get the executives, you need to get the people with hands on keyboard, everybody needs to be aligned top to bottom on that.
Completely. And so what would you say are those key steps brands must consider at let's talk about that first stage?
Sure, yeah. So I would say in general, I talk about 10 pillars that you need to think about when you're thinking about digital transformation. And it's part of the Digital Shelf Playbook series that I put together based on my experience and also working with almost hundreds of different customers and clients on the same journey. So I'll read off all 10, and then we can kind of talk about what might make sense. Awesome, so the 10 pillars are process, people and team structure, executive mentality, data and content readiness, e-commerce education, change management, content strategy, distribution priorities, value measurement, and enabling technology. Now, I know that seems like a lot, and it is not supposed to be you're working on all 10 of those things all at once. It's to say those are the elements that you need to have an understanding of across your entire journey. So to your point about being in the beginning stages and maybe not having a digital program and trying to figure out how to work this and what to do next, you really need to think about your people, your process, your executive mentality. How are you getting your executives on board to understand, why is this important? Why do I need more budget and resources? How am I going to operationalize the rest of the organization? You need to start on that journey first, because if you don't have support from the top down, you're not going to be successful, because they need to understand how e-commerce is affecting the business, how to account for it on the P&L, how to get all of the teams in marching on the same goals to be able to be successful end to end. So I would say for beginning stages, it's really people, process, executive mentality. Of course, in there, the traditional people, process, technology, always thinking about enabling technology, just because e-commerce in general also, I like to say it takes more fingertips because there's just a lot more hands-on keyboard work, just because of the breadth of what it requires.
That's an interesting point that you make about the executive mentality, because I mean, we deal with a number of large brands and we always find that the online piece is a complex piece. The online piece is a very large component now, yet it always seems to be not a priority within some parts of the organization, and almost it becomes a bit of a battle for anyone sort of working on that side. And I'm guessing you've experienced that firsthand, right? Because there's so much opportunity, but it comes with education, as in it's not, and then they get frustrated.
Yes,
because it's not working. We've had this where it's like, well, we should just give up on Amazon because it's just too much work. It's just but it's the educational piece, because it isn't too much work if you figure it out, if you manage and work in line with how it needs to be.
Yes, 100%. I've seen that firsthand, and it is one of the most challenging things. And I think a piece of that is because the level of complexity and the amount of detail that you need to understand to be able to build a strategy. And what I mean by that is executives are not going to get in the weeds about a PDP on Amazon, right? Like, what does the algorithm mean? Like, how many images do I need to put in place? But to your point, there's a level of understanding that they need to know about how all of those components lead to success on Amazon. So when I mentioned e-commerce education, that's another really important piece. You might need to be a little bit more detailed in talking to an executive just to give them the context, even to tell them it takes 5 minutes to update one product on Amazon and multiply that by 5,000 products that you have, right? Like, even just giving them that context of how many hours it will take to do the work, I think it just gives them more understanding and more of an educated opinion coming into building the strategy. And then I think it helps them unlock resources and budget for you to be successful and not have to worry about giving up on Amazon or that it's too hard or too challenging. Because I think there's that level of educating them on the external space of e-commerce and just what it means. But that does require a little bit more detail, which is a slight different approach when you're working with maybe the C-suite or the executives.
I love that. I love that approach, because it is that educational piece, isn't it? That and often frustration comes out of not knowing, but by educating. And I guess with bricks and mortar, though, is there a point where because it's so much more complex than the model of bricks and mortar, that it comes to a point that some businesses you can keep educating, but there's a point where unless you hire a resource that's going to understand it, can you convert the current resource that have always worked on bricks and mortar to just all of a sudden completely be educated and understand, for example, how Amazon works?
I think it's translating what happens on e-commerce to what is equivalent to happening in the brick and mortar store, and providing those people with the information that they need to know. So in terms of educating, it's educating each function on what's important to them rather than really fully educating, because to your point, it's very challenging, right? Like if you've been in the same industry for 50 years, it might not make sense to you, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
But if you understand that your planogram is the same as search, then you might say, oh, okay, that's interesting. So how do I think about then selling my product online? So I think it's almost just bridging the gap and just translating words, terms, things that we talk about on e-commerce to what's happening on brick and mortar. And also that continuous, you said continuous education, that's the key. It's not like one time we launched this amazing education program and we'll be good for 5 years. It's just not like that, just because technology changes, right? We're evolving just so quickly. You have to have that continuous education. But I think it's about being very specific. Like, what does sales need to know? What does marketing need to know? What do legal and regulatory need to know in terms of e-commerce to do their job in the context of broader kind of e-commerce in general? Yeah,
definitely. And I love what what you say about the translation, because it always brings back my memories from bricks and mortar. But there is that point, and we do find that there is that need to understand how bricks and mortar functions to be able to translate that. Because what I found is there's so much jargon out there in the online world, abbreviations, and definitely when you get to Amazon, but just in general, that and everybody's, and a lot of businesses are kind of have grown in the e-commerce world. They haven't grown in bricks and mortar. And so wouldn't even know, we've got, clients that have just grown online, wouldn't even know what point, when you start talking about a planogram, point of sale, a gondola end, all these things that how you kind of see different ads or space online, don't understand. But it is so vital, that translation piece, for those organizations that have been going for 50, 100 years based on that initial model.
And I also think it's important to call out that it's also great for e-commerce to learn brick and mortar, right? I
mean,
there's a value to it, right? It's been around for over 300 years, right? E-commerce has been around for what, 20, 30 years. So there's things to learn from both sides. And I think that's the key. You have to work together. You need to be able to understand how you can flex a muscle on brick and mortar or flex a muscle on e-commerce, depending on your customer. The person that's buying, what works for them. And if you can get the brick and mortar team and the e-commerce team to work together, I mean, that's the secret sauce. When you're working together, when you're collaborating, when you're leveraging the same content, the same data, you are truly then omni-channel. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, for digital transformation, that's the goal. When your brick and mortar team, your e-commerce team are flawlessly working together to the point where you don't talk about having separate teams. You're talking about selling products and commerce.
Yeah, because I can imagine it being so fragmented at the same time, right? And I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? It's that it's almost seen that there's this division between the two, between e-commerce and bricks and mortar.
And naturally, I mean, the way that organizations are built are, you have specific goals, you have things you're trying to achieve, and that just naturally creates silos if those goals are not the same across the board. So I've seen a lot of organizations actually shift in this environment to have shared goals. So every single function will have a goal to meet e-commerce numbers. And same with e-commerce, you'll have to meet brick and mortar numbers. So you're holding teams accountable for the same thing, and then you're allowing them to work together. So you're naturally then breaking down those silos where maybe previously someone would be like, oh, that's not my goal. Like, I don't need to worry about that because they're not getting compensated on it. And I mean, that's understandable, right? What gets measured gets managed. It's a kind of old saying, but it's true, because if you're not being compensated on that, or that's not your focus, then you might not be thinking about it. But then from a digital perspective, you need to have all of those different functions involved to be successful. So then you're just not helping yourself if you're siloing all those different goals altogether.
So when you talk about people then and processes, is that the ultimate goal then? Is that you're not necessarily hiring specifically and bringing people on that focus on one, and bringing in processes that focus on solely the digital? It's more about this kind of harmonization between the two.
That's what I would say. Whenever people come to me and say, hey, how do I build a team? Or I need a director of this, or we need a VP of this. I always say, let's take a step back and let's talk about what's the job that needs to be done. If you ask yourself that question first, it makes it much easier to figure out who to hire for and how to build your team. Because if at the end of the day, the problem you're trying to solve or the work you're trying to do is we need a search strategy, it doesn't matter if you have a VP or a director. You need the expertise, and you need that person to talk to both the brick and mortar and the e-commerce team, and they need to build a strategy, right? So you have to start with what are the jobs that you need to get done. And then from there, you can build your organization, and it naturally then it harmonizes those two things, because you're not talking about the specific role, you're talking about the need. What do we need to do? And the one thing I'll call out there is you have to have what I like to call the quarterback. You have to have someone who owns digital from end to end and is responsible for looking at from, hey, we're developing a new product, to it is in the consumer's hands. So you really have to have someone who's looking at that holistically and working with stakeholders and educating them and going into different teams meetings to make sure that you're thinking digitally, you're thinking omni-channel, you're having that more focused approach.
Yeah, definitely. And would you say, so in terms of common issues then, so that's sort of what you would recommend, what would you say would be the common issues that evolve when brands are going through that digital transformation?
I think the number one is that e-commerce is a small percent of their business.
True. Yeah.
So if you're talking to a traditional marketer, they might say, well, the amount of time I have to spend on getting my products online and the amount of money that it's actually kind of hitting my P&L and the percentage of my business is so small. So why should I work on it? And that's where that education piece comes in, just because e-commerce is not just going to Amazon and clicking buy. It's I'm standing in the aisle at a grocery store and I'm searching Amazon to price check and to read the PDP and all of the information about it. So it's digitally influenced. It's what does that PDP do for me, both online and offline? And that takes a level of education, and that takes a level of also that executive mentality where they're showcasing that we are investing in this as a company because we see the importance of it. We see how it will help us grow, how it'll help us grow market share, help us in our specific category. And that is really, really important for everyone to be on the same page, because if the marketers feel like that is important to them, it's important to their business, they need to be involved. They are the brand, right? They are telling the story. And if they're not helping to tell the story, then that's a major gap. So I see a lot of those kind of questions and or that friction happening in organizations because it's different. You did a TV ad, you could see all the results, right? You have all of the data, and e-commerce doesn't really have as clear data yet. Yeah. Again, it's a new industry. We're figuring it out, right? Yeah. But it's harder to say this action led to this result,
Yeah.
but we know that it is, and that there's digital influence, and that it's directly connected. So it's that education and that continuous conversation around it.
And it's such a key point that you said, in terms of it is still a small percentage. Like you read all about the online world, and when you're working in e-commerce, you think it's kind of the thing. But then when you look at the numbers, it's still not huge, and there's still so much more opportunity. And for these larger brands that are more focused on bricks and mortar, and we even find this when we work with brands, is we need brands to do the design for us. They want to use their own in-house designers, and we're like, we want to to take the design from you, let us do it, because we know that it's going to be a bottleneck, because it just becomes, it's a lot of work. It's seen as a lot of work at the start, and it's the list of priorities, and then it gets dropped, and then it takes time, and then it's evolving so quick that next minute you need something else because what you requested is no longer relevant.
Exactly. And that's why when we were talking about, if you're in the beginning of your journey, I talked about process.
Yeah.
Because that is so critical for e-commerce.
Yeah.
And I know I have a saying that I like to say, that process is a dirty word in big companies, because people kind of back away and they're like, oh, that's tactical, we don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But it is so important in e-commerce, because if you have a process, that challenge of it's a lot of work can be automated to an extent. So you can do more, you can eliminate those bottlenecks, you can make sure the handoffs are really smooth, you can automate the handoffs so that you can create more content, you can get stuff online faster, you can test and learn, you can try new things. So I would say for larger companies, it's really knowing what that process is end to end. And it might not be a fun exercise, but going through it and understanding all of the different steps, who is responsible for what, where there might be bottlenecks, where you can improve. Because if you understand that and you can clean that up and you can become more efficient, if a new trend comes out, you can say, okay, let's try it out, because we can easily test and learn. So it's that agility. And in order to be agile, you have to know internally how things work and really build out your process with every stakeholder involved, from the brick and mortar team to the digital team, supply chain. I think I've said that before, like all of those teams need to be included so that you can pivot quickly.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely a big role that it needs to cover. And I guess that was going to be one of my questions in terms of red tape with a lot of these larger companies, is that you've got these smaller businesses that are evolving in the digital world and that are just appearing out of nowhere. And it's kind of like, where did that brand come and start sneaking away, taking this market share, because they are agile, they can move quick. How are you finding that with these larger brands, as you say, that they're not agile, and trying to get everybody on board? There's always resistance to, you're going to get one team that are really up for it and the next team not. How do brands manage that to be able to compete in this fast-paced market?
I would say the first thing is there's a lot to learn on both sides there, meaning that large companies can learn from the small companies, right? There's elements of how they're being agile, how they're working through things that you can definitely learn. And then I talked to a lot of small companies, and there are a lot of things they can learn from the big brands, right? So big brands, especially very big ones, are never going to be small startups. That's just a reality. You might have small pockets of that within your organization, which I think is very impactful. But I think, to the point about kind of mapping out that process, at a big organization, you have to get everyone in the same room and everyone on the same page around what you are doing. I mean, I can remember sitting in the room talking to our legal and regulatory folks because they were taking maybe 15, 20 days to approve things. And I sat down and I was like, search terms might not be the best grammatical way of writing a sentence, but you have to insert those words so we can win on the algorithm. And then just understanding that context, we got our approval time down to 2 days. So it takes a bit more time and a bit more legwork in a large organization because there's more people and there's more moving parts. But once you sit down and you understand how all those functions, those little pieces fit into the bigger whole, then it's much easier to get rid of that red tape and or to have conversations around how to improve it, because those people and those functions understand why you're asking those questions. Because I think sometimes we forget, like, human nature. If someone's coming at you in your role and saying, like, you're not doing this right and you need to change what you're doing because this is not the way that digital handles, everyone's going to raise their hands and be like, whoa, I've been doing this for 20 years. You're telling me what I need to do differently? So just also remembering that human element to say, when you're talking to these people, they've been doing it the same way, which is fine, but you need to educate them on why you want them to do it differently. So having those conversations, mapping out how content gets made, to your point of how long it takes to create images or get them approved, mapping that out, seeing how long it takes. Is it 6 weeks? Is it 3 months? It should be 2 weeks. Like, and then evolving to try and really understand how you can get it down. And I think the other point I wanted to also make is big brands need to remember they've been doing brand building for years. They are the experts in that. So don't forget that those smaller brands, they might be able to be agile and nimble, but they don't have the years of experience those big companies have at brand building. So use that knowledge and have that translated into digital, because that's how you compete, because of all that expertise.
It's interesting how you say that. We've worked with, interestingly, some larger brands that have subsidiaries in different countries, but then it's managed by one HQ, and then you start managing the content, and the content, they come back and it's like, well, we don't like what's been written, and it's like, yeah, but what's been written has been approved, or we've translated and localized it. But it comes down, it's not about not liking it or questioning the localization work. It's actually the fundamental part that it's a completely different way of writing content. This isn't how we do it. Well, and the point that you made earlier was, yes, but this is content for search optimization, and you can eliminate that, because I think that was toing and froing and not being very clear on, we don't like this isn't correct. And it's like, well, what isn't correct? And then you realize further down the line, it's fine. It's just a different way of working. And if we had have managed that at the start, then
context. It's all about context.
Completely.
I remember walking into a room and someone said to me, they're like, I don't like the way this shows up on Amazon. And I was like, Amazon owns that website. I cannot change that. And they were like, oh, okay. And they would stop, like, kind of having that friction. I was like, this is the parameters within that we can work with, right? Like, at the end of the day, the retailer owns the website. Like, we can only play by their rules. And that to them was really eye-opening, because they worked in D2C. So they could change every element of the site. So I always come back to context. Like, just give the context, and it naturally breaks away the friction, and you can have a more open conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And what would you say then, with working with the biggest mistakes that you've seen that bricks and mortar brands make when moving over to the digital world?
The rules are different. You are playing a totally different game. When you think about brick and mortar, I mean, how big is a shelf in a store, right? It's only as big as the store can fit. Online, it is absolutely infinite. And when you think about brick and mortar, right, you might be a category captain. So you might get like the better placement on the shelf, or you might have better relationships with the retailers. That doesn't really exist in digital. There might be a little bit of that with negotiating with Amazon, but it really doesn't exist. Everyone is on an even playing field. And that means that you need to understand the rules of the game, which are totally different. And you need to understand what your competitors are doing, and you need to be able to quickly adapt to that change. Because in the brick and mortar world, what did you change the planogram like? I don't know, like twice a quarter, if that. Online, search changes every 5 minutes. Like it's just totally different rules of the game. And I think that's the biggest misconception when you're saying, hey, I want to start selling my products online. It is not that easy. You really need to understand what are the requirements for your retailers. Where does the content and data live within your organization, right?
Yeah.
You're now electronically sending that information out. If you don't even know where it lives, that's going to be a whole different ballgame internally to figure that out. So I really think the biggest mistake is saying like, we can just lift and shift what we've done in brick and mortar to online, and we're still going to be the leader in the category. No, you are starting from a blank slate, and you need to make sure that you understand each retailer that you're playing and where your priorities are. And you also need to be really, really clear on where you're focusing and what's the most important, because everything you sell in store is not necessarily going to be successful online. And that's a hard thing for a lot of companies to realize.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I mean, what you've said in terms of the level playing field, because that's so true. It is so different. You're then on algorithms, and we always get this like, how can we influence? How do we do this with the algorithm? Like there's a magic formula or a solution, and it's like, no, there's so many different areas that you need to work on, and you still can't influence it. It just functions in a completely different way. And when you were talking there, it reminded me of my days when I was first at Amazon. My background's buying, and so I was used to bricks and mortar, where you do range reviews and you select certain products that you can have within that range. And it took about 6 months to sign it off, and then another 6 months to get the product in. And then moving over to Amazon and speaking with brands, and they'd be like, come with their range, and they're like, which products are you going to select? And we used to say, we're going to have them all, and they just look frightened by that, and they're like, what do you mean you're going to have it all? No, you just start off with this. And so the customer will tell us what's going to work. Yes, but this one sells best in a store, we're just going to take it.
Doesn't matter.
And it was just the concept, just, and it's like you mentioned, it's infinite. I used to say that the Amazon's fulfillment centers, think of it as rubber walls, like they can stretch, they can put a lot more in, and all of that. And it's completely different.
And to your point, like Amazon kind of sets the rules, right? Like if you send them a pack and they decide to sell the pallet, I mean, you can't really control that. And then you need to pivot, and you need to understand how that affects your margin, right? So it's just a different game. And I think understanding the rules of that game and the playbook, to that point of what I was talking about before, you need to be able to do that, and you need your whole organization on board. And that's just a totally different realm and different world if you've been doing something the same way for sometimes hundreds of years.
Yeah, completely. And talking about it being a different world, I guess when you're with bricks and mortar, you can keep things very much to their territory, to that specific country. But once you go online, you've gone global. So how does that then work in terms of crossover of territories, etc., with brands, because they have all their subsidiaries? How should they be managing digital from a global perspective?
This is one of my favorite questions, because I think that, one, it depends on every organization and how the functions are set up, how the teams are working together. But what I have found across the board is that the local teams have to be able to activate. So if you're, let's say, for example, it's like North America, EMEA, Asia-Pac, right? Each team knows their region and or country, especially in EMEA, because there's so many countries, best. So you can't at a global level say, here's the image, here's the copy, you have to use this in the region. Because someone buying a product in the US is not the same person buying a product in France, even if it's the same product. So you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not allowing the local market to activate the content and the product the way it should. Because we all know naturally we're not the same globally, and that's the beauty of it, right? So being able to have some sort of global structure, I usually find it to be the technology piece is best. Because if you have a global technology, that means all of the regions can talk to each other from a data perspective.
Yeah.
So a lot of companies sell the same product with different variations in different countries. That means you have similar images of the product. You have similar enhanced content. You have similar creative. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're not sharing that content with all the regions and they're individually creating content. That is a budget saving opportunity, right? So you can streamline it across. It's a time saving opportunity. So having some sort of global technology to help govern each of the regions, I find to be the best mix. But then having each region be able to activate based on their customer and their local market is the most important thing to remember because they know it best. And I've also seen global teams be more focused on capabilities. So the global team is focused on what's next. What's the new big thing? Should we be on TikTok? Should we be in the metaverse? You know, things like that. They're focusing on that, and they're informing each of the regions. But the regions also need to have the budgets. Because at the end of the day, if you're activating, you need a budget in order to do that. So they need to be empowered to make those changes within their regions. So I think when you're talking about local, global, how the team should work, you really need to figure out how can they activate quickly and efficiently, and where does the budget sit? And I usually find that mix to be local activation, owning the budget with a bit of a kind of global overarching technology to be the most successful approach.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we find that a big challenge with Amazon in the way that Amazon sells this this global approach. And we often find this with brands that might come over from the US wanting to then focus on Europe and then seeing it as one, and it doesn't become one. That every marketplace is different. Interesting. I like what you say about the technology part, because there are some elements and we sort of see it as in that sort of overriding strategy. But yeah, at the same time, you can't avoid that every market is different and every market has its own nuance and has to be treated separately.
And EMEA is the best example, right? There's just so many countries, and a lot of countries only want to speak in their native language, which I get that. That makes a ton of sense, right? So how should you be selling to them? And if we go back to digital maturity and digital transformation, every country is at a different stage of digital transformation. So the amount of content or the understanding of how you need to sell in that country is very different. So that's why you need to have that local team who understands how to best activate. I mean, if you think about it, at the end of the day, we all want to have personalized selling, right? You know, I don't want to be sold something that I don't care about. I want to have it that's personalized to me. And you can't do that if you're activating from a global level. It just won't work.
Yeah. And it's interesting actually with that whole global, because we recently saw the tool with Amazon of the images, and it's always been global images, which was always something that was never well thought through at the start. And now they're allowing the localized images because they're realizing the importance of text on images and all of that.
Well, because that's the first thing you see, right? Like a lot of people on their phones don't scroll down past that. So if you're having just generic images, that you're not going to win, right? Because you want to understand more about the product, and you want to understand how it's going to affect me. And how it's going to be the best option for me, right?
Exactly.
So I think I've been having a lot of conversations about this recently, and it's just important for every brand, every company to take a step back and remember it's about the consumer, right? We are consumers. You and I buy on Amazon, right? Like put your consumer hat on, take a step back and remember why you're making these choices and why you're making these decisions, and do they make sense for the consumer?
Yeah.
I was doing a podcast the other day, and one of our guests was like, just go search on Amazon and see if you can find this product. And it was just a great step back for brands to say, go search your own products.
Yeah.
Go search your own competitors. Like, do you feel empowered to buy that product? Are you excited about it? So it's like, you just have to go back to the basics sometimes.
Completely.
And be like, okay, well, who's buying this and why?
Yeah, definitely. I used to love that sort of where you would go and run through a brand and say, did you know you're already set? I think it was when brands refused to sell on Amazon, and then you're like, have you been on Amazon and realized that you're already on there? And then you show it, and then it will be like, oh, I didn't realize.
Jaws drop.
Yeah, and it was just like one of those moments. So definitely. So Lauren, this is absolutely amazing what you've shared, and as I said, I love this topic. I think it's so exciting, and really it just shows how broad and complex it is. But really, there's this common theme of education and harmonization of all of sort of what you're trying to achieve, as in there is one common goal, what's right for the customer, which is the most important. So if you were to give a tip to a brand manufacturer that is about to commence their digital transformation, what would it be?
It would be education, hands down. Educate your teams about e-commerce, what it is, what are the rules, why it's important. Because if you do that before you start having the conversations, you're automatically removing the friction. You're automatically removing that hands up, why are you attacking me and making me change the way I do things, right? It just, you're saving yourself a lot of time. Yeah. Educate, and educate on the external landscape of e-commerce and on how to work internally, where the data is, where the systems live, how you as one person in one function are impacting the entire commerce journey and why you are important in that. So if you can do that, if you can educate, if you can provide that context, it just will make your lives so much easier, because then everyone is hopefully excited and everybody is interested and everybody sees their value and their importance in the commerce journey. So you can really build a sustainable process, team, technology to be able to transform your business and continue to transform it, because it will never be over. Yes. We will always be transforming. Definitely.
The big why we're doing it all in the first place. Awesome. Yes. Thank you so much, Lauren. You've been an awesome guest today, and for sharing your insights. I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast will be able to take away some really useful information to help them on their digital transformation. And for those that are listening and want to know more, so the Digital Shelf Institute is a community of today and tomorrow's future digital leaders. And if you're interested in becoming a member to network with others in the industry and stay up to date on the latest digital thought leadership, visit digitalshelfinstitute.org and click Become a Member. Also, if you need support executing your digital transformation strategy, eCommerce Nurse is there to support you, and you'll find the links in the description of the podcast in case you didn't get all that information that I just mentioned. All of that will be there. So thanks everyone for listening, and thanks again, Lauren, for being an amazing guest.
Thank you for having me. This was great.